friends. I am Rick, and this is your seat at the table, and we are looking at the Star Wars Rules Compendium from West End Games. Like I said, we're wrapping up on my Star Wars collection. I only have two more books to show you after today. This particular one I purchased for $15 in 1989. And the thing about Rules Compendiums, if any gamer worth their salt knows that usually in a popular game system, once the first edition rules have been put out, shortly thereafter, whether it's within the first year or several years, we usually see the arrival of some sort of supplement, i.e. 1.5 version. This would be an updated set of rules, some new rules, some things that were not included in the first edition rules that they wanted to add perhaps, but they wanted to keep the book at a reasonable size, things that the player base requested, and no matter how much play testing you do in advance of a release, there's always something that crops up later. It's for those who've never tried to design a game, and I mean really put effort into designing a game, the concept of everything's interwoven or connected. You have what I like to call the domino effect. So if you muck with one set of rules to change something that somebody doesn't like, or you want to make more challenging or less challenging, you have to be cautious, because a lot of times those have unforeseen or knowable counter or effects against other sets of rules elsewhere in the rule set. So that is a tricky thing to do, and a lot of ways to get around that is by issuing a revamped set of rules, which is what this would be considered. Several years after the first edition came out, they came out with Star Wars Second Edition, and then a decade or more went by, and they came out with, I don't think they ever had a 3.0 quote version of the original West End Games stuff, but they did. When the franchise changed owners, they came out with the D20 system that was very popular in the 90s and 2000s, and still is. I mean, that perhaps is my favorite rule system for playing Star Wars. Now, I will grant you, I have not had the privilege or the luxury of acquiring the stuff that came out in the last 10 years. So your various rule sets that you have for the much more updated set of role-playing a Star Wars role-playing game, I have no knowledge one way or another on how those work, and whether or not they're grossly different or whatever. But anyway, so what we had is says, what is the rules companion? Right? So it says, Companion is not a game unto itself. It's designed to be a companion book to the original Star Wars role-playing game system. You must have the original book in order to use this companion. From this point on, the two volumes of rules work together to create an exciting role-playing game experience. Nothing stays the same. Things grow, evolve, get better, and that's the case with Star Wars game systems. This companion volume is in part of an evolving process. It includes revisions, clarifications, and totally new rules that have been instituted to increase enjoyment of the game, enhance the movie-like spirit of the original system. Still, no rule system ever handles every contingency. That's what game mastering is all about, taking the presented rules and applying them fairly to a given situation. The end result is to have fun, and we hope that this volume increases your level of fun. So when it came out with the second edition rules, a lot of these changes in addition would have been included or modified in that edition, and that book would then supersede the first edition rule book and the original book and this companion, which I've done videos on. If you go back far enough in my many videos, you will find it sitting there someplace. So we got Chapter 1, Attributes and Skills, Combined Actions, Limitations, Stormtroopers and Combined Fire, Time and Coordination, Uncertainty Dice. Chapter 2 is Movement, Rolling Movement, Partial Movement, Overall Speed Actions, Failing Movement Rolls, Movement and Medium. Chapter 3 is Combat, Combat Sequences, Haste, Original Optional Haste Rules, Dodging and Other Reaction Skills, Other Rules for Reaction Skills, Stun, Attack, and Damage, Escaping Unscathed, Ranges for Additional Weapons. Chapter 4, Starship, Astrogation, Ship Combat Sequence, Evasion, Shielding, Starship Damage, Other Vehicles, Improving Ships, Y-Wing Statistics, scaling. Chapter 5 for the Star Warriors conversion. That is a separate game I did a bit of video on. It is a tabletop war game for Star Wars combat, space combat, starship combat specifically. So we got some updated conversions and changes, some various updated charts. Offset chart, Chapter 6, Droids and Equipment, Aliens, Droids, Creating Your Own Droids, Droid Descriptions, Improving and Adding Droid Skills, Droids in the Force, Character Equipment, Hyperdrives, Adding equipment, Weapons to Equipment, Ownership and Improvement, Technology Improving Equipment, FBZs and Equipment Improvement, Equipment Availability, Pocket Computers, Recording Rods, Spacesuits, Glow Rods, Chronometers, Breathing Mask, Synthrope. Chapter 7, Capital Ship Combat, Introduction, Caveat. Combat between capital ships takes longer than combat involving a few characters or starfighters. The ships are huge and hundreds of guns are often involved. Capital ship combat system is faster than running a battle strictly through the starship combat rules. It still takes time. Such a battle would be a key element in the story you are running. The system is designed to keep your story from getting bogged down. Ship's crews, ship's templates. Personal note when it comes to starship or capital ship combat in Star Wars universe. He's not wrong. You get a couple Star Destroyers and a couple Kamara cruisers, or you get a dozen or so frigates and light escort cruisers and so on and so forth in a combat on a tabletop. The sheer amount of firepower that's being flung back and forth between both sides is pretty intimidating. And numbers-wise, you literally could be tossing entire cupfuls of dice to try to factor things out. There's also things to take into account, facing and sections. So when you fire, if your cruiser is firing at an Imperial Star Destroyer, you're not likely to, the damage is going to hit in areas. So if you do a broadside, the Star Destroyer is actually damn near a mile long, so or longer. So if you've got multiple locations to be hitting, you're not focusing all that fire unless you specifically say so in a specific zone, if you will. One of the ways I help in my games in the past when I ran Starship Capital Combat was to fire by battery. So what I meant by that is if all port side batteries fire with one set of dice, hit or miss, and then we would average. So instead of, if you're trying to have a Star Destroyer versus a Star Destroyer, the odds of all the starboard firing weapons hitting the opponent at once is not that great. So we would have a percentage of damage afflicted, or a percentage of firepower, so 20% of the guns actually hit instead of 100% every time. Another thing to do was to, like I said, was a segment. So what we were doing was a much grander space battles in effect. We're going to minimize our interaction with it. We know it in a grand thematic thing of this huge space battle taking place. We're only going to focus on one or two capital ships verbatim. The rest of the battle hinges on the successful failure of the player characters commanding their particular cruiser and the opposing warship, or quote warships, one or two that they've come up and face against. So if they can beat their opponent, then the whole battle is in their favor, and the rest of the Rebel Alliance or the New Republic fleet is succeeding. If they're losing that battle, it's the other way around. It just speeds things up from my own version of house rules. So capital ship combat, facings, combat sequences, movement, ship damage, gun modifier chart. So, all right, so I mean, like here it says guns. If you got 250 turbo lasers all firing at once, they're going to give you a higher 5D plus 1 damage modifier. So in reality, that doesn't sound really practical, because if you look at the individual dice damage that a turbo laser does, and you take it times 250, you should literally have hundreds of dice here to toss, not 5. See, so they've tried to modify it somewhat, a little bit of artwork and stuff cost in from the various source books and movies and movie trailers and so on and so forth, posters, what have you. Command skill, starship tactics, coordinating attacks, shielding, subordinate bonuses, advanced shielding rules, shutting down a shield, targeting, increasing power to shields, spacing, ramming, starfighters, sample foreshadowing, capital ship statistics. So we got chapter of the Force, chapter 1, Force rules, dark side of the Force, effects of the points, other evils, atonement, villains, NPCs in the Force, Force using NPCs, training, mastering Force powers, chapter 2, revised Force powers. Following is a list of modifications and further explanations of existing Force powers. Most are largely the same as the role-playing book with few changes. The rest of powers have been reproduced to save you the hassle of flipping back and forth between the two books. So it's very much use this instead of the original core book for your Force skill sets and information on them. So returning to conscious, inflicting pain, far seeing, place in hibernation, transfer force, and the telekinetic kill, just some examples of what's in here. Chapter 3, new force powers. Emptiness, force of will, shift sense, dim other senses, sense force. Then we see in the adventure section, to free the forgotten. So we got a handful of adventure, mini adventures and stuff here, mini campaign or material to work from for ideas and things like that, or for one-offs. You got an afternoon to kill and you got a couple friends, or you just want to fire off a couple hour version. You just grab one of these ready to runs and off and run it. Free the Forgotten Adventure strip. You got a capital ship template. Star Wars charts. So this was pretty handy when it first came out. Like a lot of companions and compendiums and things like this, we're adding additional, and we're refining and addressing earlier issues with rule sets and adding new stuff. And then this carries you through to the next quote version, the official next release of the second edition or third edition, so on and so forth. So at some point, someplace, when second edition came out, sometime shortly after, within a year or two, there was some sort of companion or compendium or something that went to help address issues in second edition. And in part, that's because the game system was extremely popular, still is in a lot of circles. At the time, so it sustained it. I mean, you will find that there's a lot of role-playing game systems that came out, produced a handful of books, and then just went on their merry way. They either phased out, or they didn't gain enough traction to become the behemoths that some of them we know are. And then there's some middle road systems that did well for a while, that fit a niche. And once the niche was saturated, there just wasn't enough interest from other general players. The majority of role-playing game players, fans in the early days was dominated. Dungeons and Dragons was the gorilla, and they dominated a lot of everybody's stuff. And if you've got limited resources, you can only afford this and you can only afford that, or your interest is only in this. You're not interested in science fiction or science fantasy or something like that. This wouldn't be your gig. And then a lot of times, I'm thinking the original Fastest Star Trek, for example. It was pretty popular, but it was a very niche group of people. You really had to be a Trekkie to really get into it. I mean, I know some people who just generally sci-fi and like role-playing games in general and got into it, but truth was, there's a reason why when we look at Fastest stuff, the BattleTech and Shadowrun grossly overtook Star Trek, because Star Trek is actually fairly limited. There's not a lot of room for expansion beyond what's accepted by the movie and TV series mindset. MERP, Middle Earth Role-Playing Game, is another example. A great fantasy setting, but it's actually a box. It's a sandbox, but the sandbox is well defined. So you really can't, other than filling in and fluffing out and expanding on existing regions and areas in Middle Earth, there's no way to really come back and completely revamp the rules and change things, because that goes against the premise, the spirit of the game. So there's limitations. So Star Wars somewhat is in that same predicament. The difference was Star Wars was a powerhouse as a franchise, as a movie series, and lots of people who might not have otherwise played a Dungeons and Dragons game would sit down and play a Star Wars game because, hey, it's not Dungeons and Dragons. I've had a lot of discussions about that back in the day, where there were people who were adamant that Dungeons and Dragons was satanically driven, and yet had absolutely no problem playing Star Wars. They would have absolutely no problem you having a set of Star Wars books on your shelves, but if you had Dungeons and Dragons books on your shelves, you were likely to get in trouble, taken to the church, put up against the mast, taken out back and buried. It just depends on who your people were at the time. Anyhow, this is Rick, and hope you guys have a great weekend. It's kind of blustery and funky out there. Fall is quickly giving way to winter. No questions there. Till next time.